Thank you for coming out this evening. Welcome to this North Shore Parent University on the Science of Reading. We're really excited that you could come tonight. I'm Carol Smythe. I'm the Assistant Superintendent for Instruction. Would you guys like to introduce yourself?
Hello there, I'm Julie Ritter, the Director of K-12 English Language Arts.
Hello, I'm Katie Weber, Literacy Coach, K through 2.
Good evening, Karen Souza, Literacy Coach 3 through 5.
Thank you. And I just want to say before we get started, we have these three people are the most dedicated, smart, hardworking people. So the literacy of our students is in excellent hands. So as we start this presentation on the science of reading, we just wanted to kind of take a little bit of a pulse. So how many of you have know everything there is to know about the science of reading and feel like you're the experts in the field? Show of hands, okay. How many have heard about it, are familiar with it, but just want to learn a little bit more? Okay, and how many people really, this is really new to them? Okay, that's great. So we can really tailor our presentation to that. So this evening we'll really have 5 parts to our presentation. We'll do a bit of an introduction. We'll talk about what the science tells us. We'll talk about what our district is doing. And we'll discuss what families can do at home to support the literacy of their students. We'll have closing thoughts, and we'll also answer any questions that you have. So we'll start with our introduction. So before we begin to dig in, we thought we'd like to establish a working definition of the science of reading so that we're all on the same page about what it means. According to the Reading League, the science of reading is a vast interdisciplinary body of scientifically based research about reading and issues related to reading and writing. This research has been conducted over the last 5 decades across the world and is derived from thousands of studies conducted in multiple languages. The science of reading has culminated in a preponderance of evidence to inform how proficient reading and writing develop, why some have difficulty, and how we can most effectively assess and teach, and therefore improve student outcomes through prevention of and intervention for reading difficulties. So we thought we would begin talking about what the science of reading is and what it isn't. The science of reading is a vast body of scientifically based research. It is derived from multiple fields, as you can see: cognitive psychology, communication sciences, developmental psychology, education, special education, implementation science, linguistics, neuroscience, and school psychology. What it isn't. Unfortunately, there's a lot of misunderstanding about the science of reading. So let's take a look at what it isn't. It isn't an ideology or a philosophy. It's not a fad, a trend, a new idea, or a pendulum swing. It's not a political agenda. It's not a one-size-fits-all approach. It's not a program of instruction. And it's not a single specific component of instruction, such as phonics. Finally, I'd like to add that the research behind the science of reading is grade-specific, or more accurately, grade band-specific. The findings are related to developmental stages, as certain skills are highlighted in early readers, and those skills become increasingly automatic in skilled readers.
To provide some context to this evening's program, it helps to understand a little bit of the background of literacy education. You might have heard of the term reading wars. Well, our profession has debated about how to teach reading for over 100 years. Some people say the reading wars started with Horace Mann. Do you remember him? He's the father of public education. We love him for that. But in the 1880s, Horace Mann challenged the literacy instruction of the time by condemning the teaching of alphabetics and claiming that people read whole words rather than individual letters. Other people say the catalyst of the reading wars was the 1955 publication of Why Johnny Can't Read. You might have heard of that as well. Well, that book railed against man's whole language practice and advocated fiercely for phonics instruction. Since then, minor battles regarding reading instruction would flare up now and then and kind of disappear for a while until recently. It's hard to pinpoint exactly when, but now people are beginning to take notice of this growing body of scientific research. From the biennial NAEP scores, the National Assessment of Educational Progress, which revealed that in 2022, only 33% of fourth graders met basic literacy skills, to Emily Hanford's provocative podcast, Sold a Story, the current developments have caught educators' attention. It's important to note, though, that the alarming statistics I just cited and those in current media are national or state statistics. They're not North Shore statistics. North Shore students are doing comparatively well. For example, in 2022, 99% of North Shore 11th graders passed the New York State English regions. And over 5 years of data from the New York State 3 through 8 ELA assessments show that North Shore School's elementary school students consistently outperform their regional counterparts by over 20%. And yet, those successes do not abdicate our sense of duty, of semper ad meliora, always towards the better. At North Shore, we always strive to be better. Our current program has undoubtedly served us well. However, we recognize the need for continuous improvement to meet the evolving needs of our students and the ever-advancing field of education. So what does the science tell us? I welcome our resident geeks, Katie and Karen, to tell us all about it.
Hi, everybody. Katie Weber, literacy coach K through 2.
And Karen Sees, the literacy coach 3 through 5. So before we delve into that, we'd like to ask all of you, what might make reading challenging for our learners, or our students, or our children?
Some challenges in learning to read. We were just talking about some of those things, right? How. A lot of representation for the sounds in the English language. Anything else?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
Yep.
Absolutely. So we know that the complexity is vast and wide. We know already that our students need a wide knowledge base. They almost need this constellation of knowledge to be able to read. They need knowledge of phonics, phonemic awareness, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension. And to add to that complex constellation, they need other celestial bodies of knowledge, such as background knowledge, oral language, executive functioning, attention, and working memory. So let's just take a part of just some of those areas. So phonics is the knowledge that, again, we have these letters and they make certain sounds. And some of them, like you said, make more than one sound. Phonemic awareness is the base in which our language is off of, and that is often the cause of many difficulties. But that's the knowledge that I can hear, I can segment, I can isolate sounds that I'm hearing. Fluency is how smooth my tone and prosody of my voice goes up and down when I read. But comprehension is how well we understand, and vocabulary is all the words that we know to help us understand that text. And I just wanted to explore one other area, which is executive functioning. So that is how we can attend to something, how well we can follow directions, how we organize ourselves. So all of these pieces become a factor into our reading act.
So number one, it's complex. That's definitely a challenge. Number two, it has a very deep orthography. That's a fancy word. Try to say that 5 times fast. That's part of our language too. It's very, very challenging. English is the trickiest language to learn to read and write, as we were just talking about earlier. And that's because there's 44 sounds, or phonemes, that's the fancy term for that, to 250 symbols, or ways to represent those sounds, which we call graphemes. It's a complete mismatch, really. So the term deep orthography is not meant for any judgment or anything like that. It's just that in some writing systems, which this is what this means, orthography is a writing system, they are shallow. They have a one-to-one correspondence with graphemes to phonemes. Italian is like that. Spanish is like that. Those children are able to read much faster than within the English language because of that. So if we just take a look at some samples here, we have the phoneme k, right? And it gets represented by the following graphemes: K, C, CH, CC, LK, QU, CK, X, for one. Then we have the phoneme Z, which can be represented by the following graphemes: Z, double Z, S, double S, X, ZE, SE. And then those vowels, right? We have the sound A, which can be represented by all of the following graphemes below. It's a very deep orthography. Here's another example to illustrate that for you. So these words share a consistently spelled root or meaningful part. So another part of the English writing system is that it's not just a deep orthography, it's morphophonemic. So it's made up of not just letter-sound correspondence, but meaningful parts. So we have different pronunciations of the same root. Reading the first one, compress. The next one, compression. Do you hear the difference? Native, national, nativity. Do you hear the difference? Very challenging. The third challenge is that we're not wired for it. So we just wanted to do a little simulation with you so that you could ground yourself in the mind of a child learning to read for the first time, or someone learning a new language for the first time. And we want you to notice what your mind is doing as you're reading this and what might be preventing you from understanding this. You have probably all read this book before at some point, maybe to your own children. But right now it's probably in a code you may not understand unless you're a speech and language pathologist and you understand the International Phonetic Alphabet. I'll give you a hint. The book looks familiar, right? But maybe the code does not, right? So if you don't know the code, you're not going to be able to read this quickly. The words on the right here, you can read automatically. What prevents you from being able to read on the left is that you do not know the code. So it is a very complex process, especially in English, because of our deep orthography. This, on the left-hand side, is what a code can look like to a 3 or 4-year-old or to a child struggling to read or to a struggling reader. If you don't know the code, it can look like squiggles, lines, dots. It's not intuitive to us. This is a code that represents sound, and we have to make it make sense to our kids. So in order to read, we need to understand the alphabetic principle, which involves learning to map these graphic symbols to spoken speech units.
We just want you to take a moment and think about when we put up the first image of the story that did not look familiar. Your brain as a proficient reader was already trying to make sense of it. And we just want to make you aware that when you can't make sense of it, just cue into how you were feeling. And we have to build and support our young learners or students who are struggling to learn how to read and build empathy into that process to be able to support them. So thinking that we're not wired, our brain is not wired for reading, we have been reading and writing for only about 5,000 years. Does anyone want to take a guess of how long we've been speaking? How long we've had oral language, storytelling? We've been speaking for about 50,000 years. So we have a long history as humans to be able to understand communication and oral language.
So the big takeaway here, aside from the two other challenges we presented, it's complex, right? There's a constellation of skills that go into becoming a skilled reader. There's a deep orthography to our written system. And additionally, we are not wired for this. So let's just marvel at that for a second. We are building an entirely new system in our brains in order to learn how to read. And the super cool thing at this time in the field is that we have so much information on neuroscience and what is going on in the brain when we're reading. So now we're trying to build that bridge between science and education.
And an expert in the field, Dr. Louisa Moats, would say that reading is rocket science. And we just have to take a moment to marvel that our children at 4, 5, 6, and 7 years of age can use all of these different parts of their brain to be able to crack this code and take those squiggly like lines straight up across dots, these things that might look like a baseball bat and a ball, and make that into words that we can say and something that's meaningful.
It's fascinating. But the translation of these alphabetical symbols is into spoken words is only one aspect of reading. There's much more that goes into it.
So one of the ways that we can think about reading and the act of reading is a model that comes from Go and Tumner and Hoover and Tumner. About 2020, they came up with this idea that they tried to organize what the act of reading is really like into something that's called a simple view of reading, which is not simple at all. So we have two components. Our learners and our readers have to think about their reading act as two parts. We have word recognition, which is partly, again, that understanding of phonological awareness, where I can hear and differentiate those sounds. I also have phonics knowledge in word recognition, where I know that this letter will make these sounds, and I continue on my journey to add to that pile. I might know a few of those sounds, but then add on to what other sounds they can make. And then the fluency aspect of how my voice should sound when I'm reading. And it's not going to read like a robot. I want to sound fluid. I want to sound like I'm speaking. So they need this whole pile of knowledge to be able to just say the words that are on the page. They also need to know language comprehension. So that part of their brain, they need to acquire skills on comprehension, vocabulary. Some words have multiple meanings. They also need to have language concepts, how language is constructed together, not only in speech, but in the written word. And they also need to be able to communicate that. They need a strong base in oral language, and they need that practice and practice and practice. And all of this multiplied together, not just added together. It is a multiplicative relationship that provides reading comprehension, which is the ultimate goal. We want them to understand what is on the page. We want them to be able to understand in different ways. So if we think about the word recognition aspect, a lot of our pre-K, kindergarten, and first grade are really working hard every day to be able to acquire that at school and at home. So let's just think about that for a moment. If someone has, a child is struggling with word recognition, and then has strong language comprehension, if we multiply that together, we're going to continue to struggle to have reading comprehension. If a child has a strong word recognition, but struggles to be able to understand multiple meanings, has a smaller bank of language in and of itself, that child will continue to struggle with reading comprehension. Where we want to be and where we work towards every day, home and at school, to make sure that students are building their word recognition, they're building their language comprehension, not only in ELA, but in science and social studies and math, in art, in gym, and then also build that strong comprehension, reading comprehension.
And Goff and Tumner, when they originally came out with the simple view of reading, it took something so complex and tried to simplify it in a way to better understand how to support students and how to think about what areas you can support if you notice that there's a difficulty. And additionally, they found that this really was an oral language comprehension aspect. And we're going to talk about the importance of oral language in a little bit, so just keep that in mind. Okay, speaking up, we're going to talk about the connections between language and literacy. So reading and writing really depend on language abilities. Listening comprehension may exceed reading comprehension, but the reverse is not true. One cannot understand by reading what one cannot understand by listening. And there's a reason for that. All roads lead back to oral language and the spoken language regions of our brains. And hopefully if we do our job right tonight, you'll understand why that is. But oral language development, vocabulary enrichment, and verbal reasoning skills are critical components of classroom literacy instruction from the onset. And this is why speaking to children at home, reading aloud, right, doing all of this work with them is so critical, beginning in the very early stages. So even though comprehension sounds like it's such a fourth grade-like skill or a third grade-like skill, we're working on that through oral language and through listening comprehension, even in the lower grades. Okay, and now, my favorite part, how the brain learns to read. So we're talking about those spoken language regions and a little bit of the science earlier. Now we're going to connect all those parts for you. So pop quiz, it's school after all. How do you think the brain learns to read? Or how do you think the brain processes text? Is it letter by letter, word by word, or a sampling of words? Give it a guess, or maybe you know, by showing your finger for number 1, for number 2, or for number 3. Letter by letter. Isn't that incredible, right? It's so cool. It's so cool. So over the last 3 decades or so, neuroscientists and cognitive scientists have made it possible to see the reading brain at work through fMRI scans and other techniques. And studies have really targeted all aspects of reading. They have studied real word reading out of context, symbol naming, recognition of orthographic patterns within our writing system, reading fluency, sentence comprehension, passing reading comprehension. And as a result, there has been remarkable insight into how the brain reads. A lot of studies have been done on eye image movements and what we call saccades in your eyes, and they're able to see just how quickly, in like 250 milliseconds, what you're able to process when reading a text. That's given us this information. So although we may not be aware of it, we do not skip over words, read print selectively, or recognize words by sampling a few letters of print, as whole language theorists once proposed. The science debunks that. In fact, that's actually what poor readers do, or students that are struggling to read, or people that are struggling to read do, because it's a compensation. It's a way to compensate for that. What fluent readers do is they perceive each and every letter of print. And it happens so quickly, what looks like we're reading by sight, when in fact we're processing every single letter. And that's why we're able to decipher and determine the difference between words like casual and causal, grill and girl, conversation and conservation. And better readers process the internal details of printed words and match them to the individual speech sounds that combine to make words. Printed word recognition really depends on fast, accurate orthographic mapping, or what that means is the matching of letters and letter sequences with the sounds of spoken word.
One of the ways that we can support our learners at home and at school is to help them keep their eyes on the page, look at the letters, think about the sounds that they make, and be able to look through the entire word. And that is, we want that to come so naturally and quickly as if they know that word by sight and by memorization, but we are always taking in letter by letter. And as we get more proficient, larger chunks and larger chunks of the words. Is it okay if I get to geek out now too?
Yes.
Okay. So skilled readers, when we're born, our brains have visual regions to recognize face and objects. So research has found they know as young as 3 months can do this. They think it's even younger than that. And as we help students learn to read, we want to be able to develop the other area of their brain that they're not wired for, because we need to teach into looking at those letters and sounds. We really need to focus on how to do that in school and at home.
So our brains can recognize objects and faces by the age of 3 months, as Karen just said, right? I know my children were able to do that in looking at me. Mommy, they knew who they wanted to hold them, right? But skilled readers are really made. We are brain builders in the business of education. We, over time, create this visual word form area, and this comes from Stanislas Dehaene's work, where he's a cognitive neuroscience, or French cognitive neuroscience, who studied the brain, and these are some of the fMRI scans that he has published, showing the difference between a 6-year-old non-reader and a 6-year-old reader, and then a 9-year-old child with dyslexia and a 9-year-old reader, and you're able to see the different regions of the brain and how they're lighting up. But this new area, this visual word form area, is something that we end up building, and it allows skilled readers the ability to read words without much effort. Remember how we said, like, it almost seems as if we're reading by sight? It's because of that. We call that the brain's letterbox. You all have it, being skilled readers. You did not have this when you were born, but after years of reading and building, you created a letterbox in your brain. So this recruitment of this specific brain region is known as neuronal recycling. And that's just a fancy term for being able to reuse or reorganize portions of your brain to do other tasks. That's how we learn how to do something new, like driving a car or playing pickleball for the first time. That's not something you're wired for when you are born, but it is something that you are able to do over time. So again, this does not exist at birth. It actually deciphers and differentiates the difference between a child who is able to read or a person who is able to read from a non-reading brain. And this really is why we are brain builders. So we might be wondering now, well, how are words processed, right? We know it's letter by letter, but really what does that look like? So in order to read, words are processed in the brain in 3 ways. We have a vision system, we have a sound system, and we have a meaning system, okay? You can see there's already one connection between our sound and our meaning systems in our brain, right? Our goal is to make this all fuse into one neural form. So when we learn to read, we build on spoken language, which is where that sound is. When we connect to reading, we connect to vision. Notice how there's no connection yet, right? So we are born with connections between sound and meaning, but no connections to vision. So here's our goal. Our goal is for these things to fuse into one neural form, to have connections between sound, vision, and meaning. So we have to create 2 new neural pathways that did not exist prior. That's incredible. Our brain is doing like a neurological triple backflip to get us to where we need to in order to be able to read. And the big idea, the big takeaway here is that the entire foundation of the reading system is in the spoken language region. Because what are we wired for at birth? Spoken language, right? We talked about that earlier. So we want to build their spoken language as early and as often as possible, because it really creates fertile ground that they need in order to connect to their vision. And Sound City and Meaning Mountains, as we're calling them here, and this is through Carolyn Strom's work. She's a professor at NYU and has done some incredible professional development and webinars and research on how best to communicate what happens inside of our brain in a very friendly format through metaphor, which I think, and through storytelling, which I think is really well done. So you can see those connections through Sound City and Meaning Mountain. And if you just change one thing in Sound City, it changes Meaning Mountain. So for example, if you change the ending of bat to ot, you change the meaning, right? You're no longer going to picture a bat in your mind, And you might be picturing two different types of bats to begin with, right? Because context also makes a difference. If you change one thing in Sound City, it changes Meaning Mountains, and they are connected because of spoken language. So that's phase one, right? That's where we're starting. We have those connections, they're built at birth, and now we're working really hard at this brain building work, okay? So the very first thing we need to do as educators and as families is to support our children in being able to develop sound sensitivity. So they're able to process a lot of speech sounds through spoken language and what they're capable of doing. And in fact, when you're first learning a language as an infant, if you're learning two languages in the home, you often can decipher the different speech sounds between the two, even at an early stage. We want to develop more sound sensitivity within our language, which we call phonemic awareness, and the ability to perceive and play with the tiniest speech sounds in words. This is a huge predictor in learning to read, as Karen had mentioned. And these kids, if they really develop this, tend to read earlier and become stronger readers. One thing we've done in district, in our kindergarten classrooms and our first grade classrooms, is we've put in a wonderful, strong phonemic awareness curriculum called Tegrity, which we'll talk about later. But we're really trying to build this foundation. So what we want to do is we want to teach how you can segment sounds like within the word bat, b, at, right? That allows us to refine Sound City. And in order to do that, you might do some activities at home, which we'll talk about later too, right? And then eventually, when we develop sound sensitivity, we want to retrain those neurons that are used to recognize objects and faces to identify specific letters. So that's us really working on building that letterbox, right? Because those just look like squiggles and lines. And what we need to do is we need to have those things be visually tuned, right? Now to represent letters that are connected to sound. So we're making this mapping between Sound City and Vision Villages. So this line in this circle means a b, and this line in this circle means at. And this is a mapping we're not wired for, right? But it's a mapping that we need in order to read. And the only way we can learn to read and to get to Meaning Mountain, after all, as we were saying before, to get to our goal of comprehension, is to first go through Sound City. So what do these letters represent? They represent sounds. They have to go through Sound City. There's no way you can just memorize words, right? We know it's not a visual memorization process. We process every single letter, and we convert them to sounds. We're building off of that spoken language region. So once the mapping is there, which is super key, we also face another challenge, which is called mirror invariance. So if you take a look at the bottom here, that's an additional challenge that we have when it comes to mapping. So any way you put that chair, you put it to the left, you put it to the right, you put it upside down, it's still a chair. We wouldn't call it a different name. We have the same thing for faces. You can recognize your face in the mirror, right? Or in a picture. We have to unlearn mirror invariance when we learn to read. That is something our brain is wired for, and we're trying to unlearn that. So you can see the examples below here, hopefully, but we have a child here trying to write Lego, and we have the L that's backwards and the G that's backwards. You might have seen some of this writing with some of your own children. And that is just a property of our vision system that we are born with, and we're trying to unlearn. So it doesn't mean that a child is dyslexic or that there is anything really deeply going on here other than this is an aspect of our vision system we're trying to overcome eventually, and it's a challenge that we face when we're learning to map. Okay. As you can see, we have those pathways that are getting stronger and stronger and stronger. So we have our pathway to Vision Villages getting stronger to Sound City. And now our goal is to really, once we have this mapping, we want to begin blending. So we know how to segment those sounds. So now we want to blend them together. We want to hear b, at, become bat, right? And then we want to be able to send that over into Meaning Mountain, right? Is it the sporting equipment or is it the animal that we're talking about, right? So we're building that phonological root. And the first strings of letters that we really learn is with CVC words, like a consonant, vowel, consonant. It's the most common syllable in the English language, and our kindergartners will be learning that very shortly. So when you're building the phonological root, we know that writing the sounds is a reciprocal process, right? It's bidirectional. So when you're writing, you're actually taking the idea from Meaning Mountain, converting it to sound, and then back to vision villages. And that's also building the phonological root. So writing really plays a part in this too. Okay, phase 3, you can see that we're really building up our villages. We have our sound cities looking nice and strong, meaning Mountain 2, and now we're getting a little bit more complex, right? We have these connections, we have this phonological group, we're linking things to meaning, and at this stage from CVC, we're ready to move to 4-letter words. Instead of bat, now we're looking at things like bath. We're introducing digraphs, right? The TH or ship, and then or blends like step, nest, beginning and at the end. Okay, and then we have some of our long vowel sounds and our vowel teams, like in chain, treat, spoon, right? And we're building up into these larger units across our 6 syllable types that we teach. So what begins to happen is the brain's letterbox pops up. There it is. That's what we've been hoping would happen, right? That is what we begin to develop. Now we have this specialized area in Vision Villages that is specialized for these words. So once a brain has seen a word anywhere from 4 times to 40 times, it's different for every learner, the area begins to specialize for that letter string, and it activates spoken language right away. So the brain has now stored this image, and the site activates the sound, and the meaning goes on a faster neural pathway, and that's called the lexical root. And it goes right to meaning mountain. So that's when you have enough words inside your letterbox that makes it seem as though you're reading by sight, right? And this is what separates readers and non-readers, and it takes years to develop. But the most critical years for that, where our brains and the neuroplasticity is super high, is from ages 3 to 8. And then we're at phase 4. So we're no longer processing sound by sound, but by syllable type. Kids are ready for this from ages like 6 to 8, right? And you could see even, that the letterbox, look out, got even larger, right? Because now we have built a larger bank of what we call sight words, or words that these kiddos know by heart, and they're able to drive right over to those meaning mountains through that lexical route, which is the faster pathway. So now they're working on multisyllabic words. They have growing abilities to read or decode and encode or write those words with increasing automaticity. And after lots of practice, of thousands of familiar words are read in less than half a second through this lexical route. So that is really why it seems as though we're reading by sight, when we know that it's really going through all of these incredible regions, and it's taking years to build over time.
So just a quick other view of how the brain learns to read. So we have in the frontal lobe, we have the pronunciation articulation. We have our language component in green. That letter sound association is seen in partial the temporal lobe and the parietal lobe, as well as the visual word form area. So what's pretty cool is that our brain is like this team where all of these parts are kind of working together to be able to look at the word and be able to say that word. And then what's exciting is that as novice readers are using mostly the frontal lobe to be able to decipher all of these words and working really hard to say what's on the page. And as they become automatic and they're becoming efficient in being able to say these words, and they no longer use as much in the frontal lobe, that they move, most of their thinking comes to the back of the brain. And what's wonderful about that is kind of releases the brain and lightens their cognitive load to be able to really do some deep thinking and making connections and synthesizing information, questioning what's going on in the text and seeing information that doesn't match up. So it can really be exciting in the mid to upper elementary age, where they kind of have let go of this, even though we're working on the comprehension through read aloud, but that independence really kind of comes into their thinking around them.
And that all makes a lot of sense, right? Because that's where our phonological root is, in the frontal lobe. So if you're a kindergartner, first grade, you're really working on those mappings. And then over time, your letterbox becomes really strong and really big, and you've developed this amazing sight word vocabulary. Now you're working off of this back region, right, which makes it seem as though you're reading by sight.
Thank you. Every time I hear you guys speak about this, I learn more. So that was wonderful. Okay, so the next thing we wanted to discuss with you is what our district is doing related to this information about the science of reading. So currently, we are undergoing a comprehensive review and revision of our elementary literacy program. The most important thing to highlight is that we're not jumping to conclusions. We're not stabbing in the dark. We're not applying quick fix Band-Aids to complex issues. Instead, we are using a systematic, well-considered, and methodical, oh my goodness, sorry about that, approach. Speaking of language, exactly. We are examining the broad, systems-wide influences on literacy. Instead of limiting ourselves to a narrow scope, we are looking at the multifaceted structures that affect our literacy program. We are planning and executing short-term and long-term actions. We are reviewing and revising our literacy program, and this will take place over time. Right now, we're maintaining the stability of our current instruction, assessments, and curriculum, while new infrastructures are being planned and built. This is a key part of our plan. We're committed to maintaining stability for our students and teachers. Many of you have probably heard of the three-legged stool rule. Well, the three-legged stool rule says never to remove a leg of the stool unless you have another one set firmly in its place. We are extremely mindful of that because we know we're trying to enforce change, and we want to make sure we're ready to support that change, because if we're not ready to support our change, we're going to undermine our progress. We're going to honor and support our teachers' differentiated shifts as we learn more and build more systems.
So the plan that Carol described is actually two-pronged. So we are simultaneously deepening our knowledge of the science of reading, and that really applies to all stakeholders, teachers, community members, parents, and administrators. And we're also employing this systems-wide approach to evaluating and revising our literacy program. So let me tell you about what we're doing to deepen our science of reading knowledge. As you saw from just dipping your toes into the science of reading, its vast context is rigorous, and it can't be appropriately processed with just a one-and-done approach. Teachers need repeated and ongoing PD to reinforce and deepen their understanding. In the fall of last year, Mark Weekland, author of How to Prevent Reading Difficulties, conducted on-site PD workshops for our elementary teachers. Then in the winter and spring of last year, we led a 40-person group of K-12 teachers, and we took a deep dive into the research. We read and analyzed the 450-page National Reading Panel report, several scholarly meta-analyses, and book excerpts from the leading voices in the science of reading research. This year, we've enrolled our staff member in letters training, which I'll discuss in depth in the following slides, and our continuing in-house and expert PD, including last week's 100-person Superintendent Conference Day workshop by Katie and Karen, and events like this Parent University. So as mentioned in the last slide, a major tool to help us build our capacity about the science of reading is Letters, Language Essentials for Teachers of Reading and Spelling. Letters, this year we've enrolled all the elementary school literacy teachers. We've also enrolled the 3 elementary school principals, the assistant director of elementary special ed, and the 4 of us. We've been taking this rigorous, inspiring, and weighty course, and we're about 2 months in, so we kind of just started. As participants in Letters, we complete graduate-level coursework online, read a textbook-styled manual, and engage in 4 full-day in-person workshops per year. And the goal of Letters is to provide knowledge and tools that teachers can use with any good reading program. So some of you might be wondering, why don't we just hand the teachers a new curriculum now? The reason is really significant. Teaching isn't just delivering content or reading a script. It's about understanding the reasons behind the educational moves that we make. Educators have to use deliberate, purposeful, and creative problem solving in order to diagnose and meet the specific and varied needs of our kids that are right in front of us. Without a deep understanding of the science of reading, those goals would be impossible to attain. We're fond of using this auto mechanic analogy to make our point. Knowing how to drive a car in perfect conditions is usually okay. But if something happens or if something needs attention, it's important to know what you're looking at under the hood. It's the same thing with teaching.
So we are really looking to employ a systems-wide approach to our change. We have constructed 2 vehicles for our systems-wide approach. One tool is our enrollment in Letters for Administrators. This is a course in addition to the Letters for Teachers one. The Letters for Administrators course is helping us to support teachers as they work to implement the science of reading aligned practices in their classrooms by enacting the systems and infrastructure needed for implementation. The other tool for employing a systems-wide approach is the creation of a district literacy team to oversee the evaluation and revision process. The 15-person district literacy team is comprised of the 4 of us, our 3 elementary principals, our assistant director of special education, and 7 elementary school teachers representing classroom, reading, ENL, and special education. We meet for a full day each month and work on the 7 components of a school-wide literacy system.
So let's talk a little bit about what you can do at home to support reading. And I'm probably going to say something you don't want to hear, but other way is treat your children or your child as a conversationalist. That means let them talk and talk and talk and have a volley of conversation. It's important for them to have interactions with adults. It's also important for them to talk with their peers and varying ages as they talk, because that promotes oral language, but it also provides different contexts and different experiences to build on their vocabulary. And also reading aloud to your children, even as I would say up to middle school, they do enjoy it, and it just provides opportunities to talk about those books. So I know it's, as they get older into, 4th and 5th grade, they might not want to sit on your lap anymore, but reading or talking about books or reading the same books and having conversations is really important with them. Also, board games that promote that language development, like Scrabble is great. Dramatic play when they're younger, they'll eventually grow out of that, but that was an endearing phase for my own children. And I think, surprisingly enough, the research shows that students who are good storytellers will be fantastic readers and writers. So it's even more powerful than reading and writing at home and in school. So it could start out like something like, once upon a time there was a knight, and that's the story. And then asking them to expand on that as they tell the next story, or what else happens, where did this happen? Ask questions to really support that. And even as a parent, telling stories and having them add to it is really also important as well.
Building on that, my mom always did that when I was growing up. She invented a character called Lily O'Reilly, and whatever we struggled with during the day, Lily O'Reilly did too before bed. And she made sure to tie that into a story with a nice little lesson before bedtime. And then I find myself doing that with my daughter now. So storytelling can really take us places, can it? So there are some ways we are really supporting language development, and let this be said on record, these are not the only ways. We support language development through and through, from the tippy top of our day to the very end of our day in many ways, but we do have some core curriculum that supports it. We have Heggerty, as I spoke about before, which is used to develop our students' phonological awareness and phonemic awareness. And originally we rolled this out in kindergarten last year, and we had such wonderful success with it. Our students felt successful. Our teachers were amazed by the growth that we saw in our kiddos from the beginning of the year to the end of the year. And they really developed their sound sensitivity. And because we had so much success with that, and we know how important it is to develop Sound City for our kiddos and to develop all of that sound sensitivity to make them to be strong readers and writers, we also have rolled this out into first grade this year as well. Finding just as much success. The teachers love it and the students love it. Foundations is used to develop our students' decoding and encoding skills in grades K through 3, and it takes a systematic multisensory approach to instruction. You may see materials coming home. This was originally a K through 2 curriculum, and we have, again, found so much success with this and have found that it really benefits our students in their phonics instruction and in that word recognition work that we're asking of our kiddos to do as we're building those letter boxes. And so we have also rolled this out into third grade as well. And then in grades 4 and 5, we use Words Their Way, and this is used to develop students' vocabulary and their growth in spelling development in grades, like I said, in grades 4 and 5. And they're also working on syllables and affixes and derivational relations and all of these incredible parts of our writing system that make it morphophonemic.
For our learners who are in pre-K, kindergarten, and first grade, there are books out that have been published that are very playful. So even though you read them, they're listening to the language and trying to isolate those sounds. Some of them are very silly, so it's always wonderful to get a little silly with books. And then there's also opportunities to play some games. So instead of playing I Spy, you might play I See. I see something that starts with ch. Find something in the room that starts with ch. Or another game is say the word mop. If I change the beginning sound to t, what's the new word? Or the ending sound. So becoming playful with language is also important. Rhyming is also important. I'm thinking of a color that rhymes with Zello. What is the color? And they always think it's so silly because you're saying the color wrong, and you should know the color. Tongue twisters are always, I think, very playful, and even riddles could be fun. And syllable shopping, it could be any place where you are. I'm going to say a word. You're going to tell me how many syllables on there. Eggplant, eggplant. So let's break up those words together and become hear those syllables, because as they become older, they'll need to apply that strategy to say longer words in third, fourth, and fifth, and sixth, and above. Or a sound scavenger hunt. Find 5 things in the house that begin with the sound t. Let's see who can come back first. Let's see who's going to win this time. So it could be playful as well and supportive.
So just diving deeper into some of our curriculum here, this is a piece of Foundations. It's our phonics curriculum, which is the study of relationships between letters and sounds that they represent. So this is one way we really support students in developing their alphabetic principle, which hopefully we now have a common understanding in that how important this is to map those squiggly lines, right, or those dots into our spoken language regions to sounds. So we use letter tile boards in order to do that. We use sound cards and a lot of other resources, in addition to a chart that looks like this that you may or may not be familiar with. And we have keywords that represent each of the letters with the sounds. So A, apple, A, B, bat, B, C, cat, K, D, dog, D, right? And we're teaching our kiddos to really clip those sounds very carefully to make sure that we're not adding any schwa at the end to help them along. We also wanted to talk about sight words. So every word, when it grows up, wants to be a sight word. Someone famous said that, but I don't know who off the top of my head at the moment. But it's true. We have so many words in the English language, and some are regular, some are irregular, right? And at the end of the day, our hope is that in building that letterbox, that all of them eventually become sight words for us, that we can read automatically by sight. So in Foundations, we teach something called trick words, and these are words that can be quite challenging for our students. And we have been exploring some ways to best teach those understanding the science. And one of those ways is called the heart word method. So it's a way to help students read and spell high frequency words, particularly those that are irregular and not very decodable. So one thing you might do, like in the word said, for example, is you might highlight the tricky to make it sticky. So if you think about what is phonetically regular in said, right, it's the beginning sound and the ending sound, right? They both represent those sounds correctly. But if you listen to that middle part, it sounds like eh, right? So that's spelled irregularly. And that's a part that we would have to know by heart, right? So that might be a heart part. And what we're teaching our students in some classes and exploring, you might see this method coming home, there might be like a little heart above the parts that are quite tricky for us. So that's another method that we're working on. And we're trying to build this bank of words for them that are both regularly spelled and irregularly spelled. Additional ways to support decoding, reading, and encoding writing is through foundations practice. You might have some family letters coming home to explore what's happening inside of the classroom. And you might practice some things at home, like letter formation, fluency, dictation, which is where you might say a word for a student or your child to write, to have them practice. Teachers might be sending home additional practice pages on concepts learned or decodable text so that they can practice those learned concepts inside of books. It might also be in phrases or in sentences as well. And you can explore these opportunities with your child in very family-friendly ways. I have a first grader myself, and one of the things that I have her do is write our grocery list. And I'm looking to see, is she applying the phonics concepts that she's learned in foundations? And then I'm helping her with the other parts that she may need help with. But that's a life skill, right? So let's make a list together, or Christmas list, or a birthday list, right? But ways to practice at home.
And two last ways that we'll talk about this evening is more around, this part is around comprehension, and it's to Just Ask 3 campaign. I know it can be overwhelming. I know there's a lot going on at home. I know there's lots of activities and things to do. But just thinking about before a child reads a book, asking the question, what do you think the book is going to be about? Just giving some background knowledge, trying to access that book, looking at the back cover might help them just give an insight or a step into that book. If they read for a little bit, during that reading, it doesn't have to be a certain amount of pages, just ask, so what have you read about so far? Letting them retell, give an account for the characters, setting, give information that, of what the events are, and at the end, they don't have to finish the book. If it's a chapter book when they're older, just now that you're done reading for today or this moment, what have you read all together? And thinking about being able to sum it up. And we encourage you to help students get into chapter books, because then they can flutter to the next book and they hop right into the next book, because volume is a part of this. Or read about their interests and hobbies as well, so they continue to build background knowledge. They make some words that you don't think are words that they should know by heart, like basketball. If they're in kindergarten, they'll be able to read that if they're reading those books. And we often have students in book clubs from kindergarten through 5th grade in the elementary school, having book clubs at home. I know it might not be cool, but if they have something in common, or they're reading something similar with a peer, it would be very helpful. And the last aspect is to find a time, and it doesn't matter, morning, after homework, right before bed, that is reading time at home. And I know it's really hard to do that, and it might only happen a couple times a week to start, if it's not happening, because sorry, I'm blanking on his name, Gladwell. He wrote the book Outliers. He made the 10,000 hour study popular, and it really means to delve intensely, do something for 10,000 hours to be able to master that. And the same goes for reading. So we really want our children involved in text, and that could be reading two, you reading a page, they're reading a page, or they're reading all together. It is that cumulative volume that we also want them engaged to understand how language is presented on the page, and to also build that background knowledge and vocabulary.
Before we end tonight's session, we have some closing thoughts just to summarize what we discussed. As Katie and Karen showed, the parent-school partnership explicitly supports our students' lifelong academic success. By integrating literacy into your daily routines and by reinforcing the reading and writing work your child does in school, you'll be helping them develop the skills they need in all their future endeavors. Together, we forge an unbeatable alliance. And finally, by aligning our literacy program more closely with the science of reading, North Shore is fulfilling our commitment to evidence-based education. This work is really challenging, but nothing can stop us from reaching our goals. As we continue on this journey, we will maintain stability with a thoughtful and deliberate plan, because we know that we're allowed to be both a masterpiece and a work in progress at the same time. Questions or comments?
That's our plan. Yes. Sure. So the Science of Reading really isn't a program. And to your point, and it was in the early part of the presentation, the work we're doing really isn't because we recognized a deficit. Like what we're seeing is we're trying to apply the learning about the science of reading to become even stronger. To your point about your son not wanting to read certain types of books, I think some of that is middle school. And I think we at school and you at home really should encourage that broad breadth of different types of literature. I do think there's something to be said for when high school comes around, that'll change a little bit. To your point about the Chromebooks, we actually have a technology committee that is looking at our use of technology kind of K through 12 as well. There's a place for instructional technology, and we're really trying to find what that good balance is in terms of how much kids are using them. We've been very concerned about and kind of engulfed in the research about how much screen time kids should have both at school and at home. So you bring up a lot of good points. You're welcome. Any other questions? Yeah, assessments are actually one of those 7 dimensions that we're really looking at as part of our district literacy team. We've made some shifts this year in terms of our assessments. For example, we transitioned to DIBELS 8 in kindergarten, but that it will be one of those pieces that we look at as part of our committee to make sure all of our work is aligned, what program we're using, what instructional approach, what are our reading interventions, because as you mentioned, probably the most important thing is, are we assessing the child's progress and using that information to drive instruction? But that is absolutely one of the things we're diving into. One of you guys want to turn it over to the...
So as Dr. Smythe mentioned, this is another area that we're critically focusing on, right? So we're looking at our Tier 1 instruction and making sure that our core instruction is very strong. And one of the things that our teachers have always done here very beautifully is attend to the need of every learner. And we are committed to that still, regardless of any shift in practice. That's something that will be a lodestar for us that we will keep true to. It may look a little differently though now, right? So based off of our assessments, we might take a look at what skills students need support in and support them in skills as they move forward. So some of our screening assessments and some of our ladder diagnostic assessments or in-class assessments may show that they have a need in support for phonemic awareness, so they may support them with some additional Hegarty work in a small group, right? It may even be so specific where they need more support with letter-sound correspondence, so we may support them on that skill. Even before we get into books, right, we're looking at making sure that all of these foundational skills are really shored up and strong. And teachers have groups that may look like, well, these kiddos are ready for isolating the first sound, but I have a group of kids that are ready for isolating the last sound. It's that specific in some cases. So we're really taking a look at what skills they are ready for, and we're making sure that our groups and our grouping of students is refined to that. Does that answer your question? Okay. Okay, good.
Okay, any other questions? So again, we really can't thank you enough for coming out this evening. We will absolutely share the slides with you so you have them. But if you have any other questions, please feel free to email me, and please continue to come to our parent universities. So have a great evening, and hope to see you soon. And happy Thanksgiving.